whole-of-government approach. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, CSIS, for this invitation. I usually want to be the last speaker because I'm a bit talkative, but I was wondering if anyone will be left here in the audience. I'm glad there's still people here, although it's already morning in Asia Pacific, so I'm assured of one additional audience just in case, and thank you very much for sticking around. Of course, also as a caveat, none of the things that I'm going to say are a reflection of any of my myriad of affiliations, probably not even a reflection of my private views sometimes. Nonetheless, I will try to keep this as short as possible and stick to the points. Should I press this one? Is this working? Oh, geez.
You press the right one, now you need to shut that off.
Oh, jeez.
Go anywhere.
Okay. That's the other abnormal. Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So very quickly, I'll go through the following elements. First of all, the question we're beginning to confront increasingly is whether an ADIZ by China in the South China Sea is a matter of when rather than a matter of if. And the second thing is what kind of pushback we're seeing from the United States and other major powers around the world. And that was the context within which I was asking Mr. Shriver a while ago, what is the difference with the new Trump administration, aside from the language and cadence of his pronouncement? Because if it's just going to be a reiteration of the strategy of the previous administration, we know that didn't work, right? The third thing is, of course, the Duterte shock. As a kind of an official Dutertologist, I believe that this is something we have to discuss because it seems single-handedly the Philippines has become quite re-scrambling the picture on the ground. And lastly, this is something I and Don and Amy have been discussing since the Shangri-La dialogue. What are the minimums we can talk about here whereby everyone can agree? So Collins did a very good job of talking about divergence in threat perceptions, but I think discursively and on the level of principle, there are certain things that all of us should agree with, and I think that's the next thing we have to keep in mind. Now, of course, we know that the reclamation and militarization in the South China Sea has been more or less the signature policy of President Xi Jinping, although, of course, Bonnie was completely correct to say that Chinese assertiveness started during the Hu Jintao administration in the mid-2000s. And of course, what we see over the past year or so is essentially militarization on steroids. So for the first time, we see deployment of ACBMs and SAMs, as well as electronic jamming equipment to disputed land features in the Spratlys. You also have the nuclear-capable bombers being displayed and having exercises there in the Paracel chain of islands. Of course, of concern to us is also acceleration, reclamation, and completion of military facilities, more or less by China on this disputed or an artificially created islands. And of course, recently we also saw that China has put the Chinese Coast Guard under the command of the PLA Navy, which is quite an interesting development. Now let's see whether they'll still have that plausible deniability that Collins was talking about a while ago. And of course, just a few months earlier, you had the largest naval exercise by China, opened by no less than Xi Jinping, which was a big factor in a big splash. Now, the good thing is, of course, it seems there's some pushback, not only by the United States, but we also see that the Europeans are joining the fray. The French, the British also conducted their own versions of FONOPS earlier this year. And of course, we got to know that Mr. Macron will be the next speaker at the Shangri-La Dialogue, so that talks about the growing role of France, perhaps here in the Indo-Pacific. We know that Australia right now is also considering going beyond just doing aerial patrols in the area and possibly doing its FONOPS, or at least that kind of debate is gaining ground, and India and Japan are also expanding their footprint in the area. Nonetheless, I think I and Greg and Bonnie and a lot of us will agree that FONOPS alone actually could become counterproductive, because alone they're provocative enough to give China always an excuse to say that, oh, we have to develop our facilities because US is threatening us, right? This is the problem. But it's not really robust enough to deter the assertiveness of China. So in that sense, it actually just alone can become more counterproductive than productive. So it's not only just empty tactics. It doesn't really, fulfill its specific objective. Now, the point is this: we can always complain about what is the United States doing, what is the international community doing, but the question we have to ask is, what are the claimant states themselves doing? And we know that over the past 5 or 6 years, the Philippines has been at the vortex of resistance within the ASEAN against China, and that vortex essentially fell apart when President Duterte came into power and said that, we want a soft landing in the South China Sea. He said personally he's going to set aside the arbitration award. That's not the official position of our government, and could kudos to our friends at the Department of Foreign Affairs, always issuing clarificatory statement, including on the statements of our foreign secretary sometimes. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind last year when the Philippines was the ASEAN chairman was this quite fantastic development whereby we went even lower than Cambodia, because Cambodia said, let's not talk about South China Sea. President Duterte said, oh, South China Sea dispute, that has to be left untouched by the international community, and the Philippines and China have to deal with this issue rather on a bilateral level. In fact, what was even more interesting was when our foreign secretary during the ASEAN Regional Forum said, to paraphrase him, it is our sovereign right not to assert our sovereign right under the arbitration award, right? So some interesting things were happening last year, and I think I felt bad for our friends in Singapore because suddenly, the compensatory expectations from Singapore were too high. So, all kudos to Singapore, you're doing your best. And of course, the rhetoric of the president, which follows more quantum mechanics rather than, loss of diplomacy. He talks about China as his personal protector. He says that we have to be meek and humble for China's mercy. I think these are things that even put Cambodia and Laos to shame in terms of who's most loyal to China in the region. But one thing that is essential, it's true that the Philippines' military capabilities are limited, but the Philippines is essential to America's ability to forward deploy its military prowess in the region, and that's where Duterte's decision to downgrade our defense relationship with the United States has been of great importance, not to mention his colorful language, of course, against the United States. Now, we know that under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, 5 different bases were discussed. 2 of those bases, Basa Air Base and Antonio Bautista, are extremely important because they're close to the Spratly chain of islands, and Basa Air Base is very close to Scarborough Shoal. Now, Greg and folks have done good research on that. I did my own separate research, and it seems we are seeing a lot of delays, a lot of disagreements, not only between the 2 sides, but within countries, and also downgrades. Like, of course, the initial discussion when EDCA was being negotiated was, Americans will preposition equipment. They'll develop facilities in the area and eventually turn it out to the Philippines. But that's not happening because I think President Duterte has made a strategic decision to make sure that yes, our alliance with the U.S. will continue, but that alliance in no way should be pointing at China like a dagger. Otherwise, my normalization of ties with China will be affected. Now, even more interestingly, we're seeing the phenomenon of China sending warships and aircrafts to the Davao City without any legal reference point. And this is what I call the mayor's diplomacy. So it seems what's happening in the Philippines is, the Chinese call mayor turned President Duterte. Duterte says fine, and everything pushes through, even though we don't have any status of forces agreement or a defense agreement with the Chinese. Now, the PDP Laban, which is the ruling party in the Philippines, is pushing actually for a formal agreement with China, which I think in the context of how things are happening, maybe is a more sensible way moving forward. I mean, what is the legal reference point if something happens? As some folks were saying, I mean, how do the Chinese citizens enter the Philippine territory? Do they get visa? So this is the interesting thing that I call mayor's diplomacy. Now, we see visits by Chinese warships, by Chinese aircrafts. So what is this all about? Is it part of China conducting more surveillance in the area to see what the Americans are doing in nearby bases? Is this a strategy of conclave whereby China will slowly expand its presence in the Philippines militarily in an unprecedented fashion? Is it a test case to see what will be the reaction of people? So I think this is something very interesting that we have to look at over the coming months and years. Now, nonetheless, the interesting in the Philippines is that you have the phenomenon of a dual government. So the president says something, the foreign secretary tries to explain it, but the defense establishment has a totally stance on this particular issue, which makes the Philippines one of the most exciting countries to watch, not because I come from there. Now, the AFP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, made it very clear that they have a constitutional duty, meaning not necessarily they're going to follow the president, whatever he says. They have a constitutional duty to protect the Philippine sovereignty and territorial integrity. I think the usage of that term was intentional. And in an unprecedented fashion in the Philippines, you have situations whereby the spokesman of the Armed Forces of the Philippines instructs the foreign ministry to stand up to China. I've never seen that happening anywhere in the world. Or folks within the military leak information to some folks in the Department of Foreign Affairs to leak it to some opposition members or media to pressure and embarrass the president. Again, I have not seen this in any other country so far. And that talks about the Latino kind of democracy we have in the Philippines. Another interesting thing happened in the last year was slowly the military is restoring our security cooperation with the U.S. Maybe you can call it the Trump magic, whatever it is. The Balikatan exercises, there was a 60% increase in terms of the number of participants. So we're back to the 8,000 people. And interestingly, we had the return of joint amphibious exercises with China in the South China Sea. As you may know, and as we predicted almost precisely, President Duterte will cancel all military exercises with the U.S. in the South China Sea. Fiblex and Carrot, and he relocated Balikatan from South China Sea in the first year. But now in the second year, the military slowly bring it back. I don't know what's happening. Is it because the president is so distracted, or the president cannot say no because the military is kind of a veto player in the Philippines? And more than ever, you have the visit of American aircraft carriers. I think there were 3 American aircraft carriers visited the Philippines in the first half of this year, which has never happened, as far as I know, in the last 20 years. So what essentially has happened here is that the AFP in the Philippines has prevented or vetoed a strategic alignment by the Philippines with China, but the president more or less is doing what I call strategic leaning towards China. So there is a diversification happening there, but this diversification is a very contested field. Okay, what about the Filipino people? Very interesting. Over the past month, it seems the Filipino people are speaking out. So according to the Pulse Asia survey, 7 out of 10 Filipinos are saying the government of Duterte should assert the Philippines' sovereign rights based on the ruling. By the way, it's not a PCA, it's an arbitral tribunal under Article 287, Annex 7, but I told them to correct that. They never do that. Another survey came out by SWS, even more interesting. 87% of Filipinos said we have to reclaim those islands that were occupied by China. So people are asking, what about those occupied by Vietnam and other countries? But that's a different question. And 81% of the Filipinos said, oh no, because the rhetoric that we get from some folks in the government or us as well, if China invests in our infrastructure, maybe we should just be quiet on the South China Sea. Well, 81% Filipinos said no. That's not how we deal with it. So the Filipino people are very clear with that. Now, what is and of course, this is where it gets interesting. China's approval ratings don't seem to be really improving much. If anything, they have been going down over the past few months. So despite the best efforts of President Duterte to show China as our partner for national development, as our best friend, and so on and so forth, Filipino people seem to be very, very skeptical, right? And this is relevant because if this is the public sentiment, and if this is China's approval rating, even if Duterte is still popular, we can still debate about what popularity means in the Philippines' elongated honeymoon period of 3 years. The fact of the matter is that it will become easier for people in bureaucracy to push back if they feel the people are on their side, even if the president is popular. So this has relevance, and we see President Duterte, or at least Foreign Secretary Cayetano, also making recalibrations and issuing in June actually red lines, whereby saying, you know what, it's not like we're ignoring what the Chinese are doing. If the Chinese reclaim and deploy weaponries to Scarborough Shoal, that's a red line. And in fact, they didn't have to say it because we know that's a red line for the Philippine military. As Secretary Lorenzana said, it's too close for us to have it acceptable. And the Filipino people see Scarborough Shoal as part of our national territory. Second, in fact, in fairness to President Duterte, he said that in December 2016, but he says so many things people forget about the better things he says. He actually said a unilateral exploitation of energy resources, drilling by China, will be a basis for him to raise the arbitration award. So if they pull off what they did to Vietnam to us, even Duterte is going to have a tougher stance on them. And lastly, coercive expulsion of Philippine Marine detachment in the second term. I'm almost done. Way forward, what is the way forward? I think this is where I and Don have been talking about this. Like, is the whole Indo-Pacific really a shrinkage as far as ASEAN is concerned? Because our fear is maybe it's a polite way of saying, okay, ASEAN is not doing its job. It's too divided. Maybe the big boys should come together and constrain China on their own. We hope that's not the case because we believe the way forward is actually engagement with China. First, on the level of capacity building, and second, for pushing in terms of new baselines, principles that we have to agree. In terms of capacity building, of course, we see a lot of efforts, in fairness, by Japan. Not many people are perhaps talking about that. In terms of developing the ISR and maritime security capabilities of Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia, Collins did a very good job in terms of showing how depressing the situation is, but at least a lot of ASEAN countries are now developing a functioning Coast Guard, and we're getting there soon. And the second thing, of course, is you have the Maritime Security Initiative. I was told that there's a new initiative, the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, that is being pushed. There's even more money here, so I'm more excited about this. So we need investment in the capacity of other countries, and we're glad that this is being extended to other key countries like Indonesia in the region. Now, Australia has been very active in terms of counterterrorism cooperation. They help a lot the Philippines and Marawi, but we want to see more of Australian assistance in terms of maritime security development. In fact, even the South Koreans and Indians are getting involved in this issue. So I think those are good developments. And last slide, I think this is one thing we all have to agree, and I think even the Chinese should not disagree with this, which is the idea that no single country has to have sole control in the South China Sea. It's an international waterway. It's a sea lines of communication, perhaps the most important next to Persian Gulf. And interestingly, you're seeing a lot of leaders, senior leaders in the ASEAN, coming up with interesting, if not fanciful ideas. Mahathir is pushing for complete demilitarization, meaning no warships in the area. And Jokowi has been talking about joint patrols by perhaps non-claimant states in the South China Sea. Now, the point is, we don't know if these ideas will be bought by ASEAN, but we know on the individual level, Indonesia is pushing back against China, which is an important thing. And we know that, Mahathir, he's now the big guy again in ASEAN, and before him it was Duterte, right? So with Mahathir there, perhaps there will be a new language about what ASEAN should do. And we know that Mahathir is very critical of US, very critical of the new president here, but he's also critical of China. And even if he were not critical of China, domestic politics in Malaysia has been, the whole Najib thing is tied to China, and that is going to put some pressure on Mahathir to toughen up the language. And lastly, code of conduct. Of course, we're all skeptical about code of conduct. We hope the code of conduct is in consonance with international law, but any code of conduct should go with the triple freeze: a freeze on reclamation, a freeze on militarization, and a freeze on major naval exercises. Otherwise, what's the point with that? Okay, as I said, my caveat, perhaps they don't even reflect my personal views, but looking forward to the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you.